Today we had a big day, and the Holy Father gave us a wonderful speech, and which contains a mission. But what I was struck about was the fact that when he arrived, he didn't go to his chair as he used to do. So I went to many audiences, and of course he always goes to take his chair, to sit there, and then he used to greet people afterwards. But today happened something different. So he went to greet Martin, Helen, and Francesca. So I'm very grateful for you, Helen and Francesca, to have made it and to be here with all of us. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So your work is a great inspiration for all of us. The people you see here are poets, writers, and from many countries of the world, from America, from Asia, from Africa, and from Europe. And so in front of you, you don't see journalists or other kind of people, but people who like your work and like to work about creativity and inspiration. So our desire, when I ask you if you were able to come over here, is to listen your experience. So it's kind of a sharing your experience. So it's not going to be a talk, but a question and answer section. So I want to start talking about a personal experience. So I wrote a book called Una trama divina, Divine Plot, and I sent this book to Pope Francis before it was published, and he was so nice to me because he wrote a preface, a wonderful preface. So usually I suggest people to buy this book, not because I wrote this book, but because the preface. And he quoted this morning. And I found it so inspiring, and I desired to share it with Martin. And so I sent it to him. After some days, maybe 10 days or something like that, he answered me saying, I felt very inspired by this preface, and I decided to give an answer. To say something. But I'm not a philosopher. I'm a director. So what he did was to send me a script about a possible movie about Jesus. So I remember that very day, because when I received this email from him, I was in France with a Jesuit friend. That was something like December the 30th or the 31st, something like that. So I was in vacation. And I started swirling around the room and feeling a sense of responsibility myself and pondering what I should do with it. You felt the force of a personal invitation. You had to respond. Not with an essay, but as a director. You brought me with a script, you brought me in that email something that captures the eye and the mind in an unexpected way. Tell me now, please, what struck you about that call, and what did you feel resonated within you, the call from Pope Francis?
Well, I think because I've been so much, the church has been so much part of my life since growing up in the 1940s and 50s, that the very question and the very, I should say, suggestion from His Holiness is something that I've been grappling with since I was 13 or 14 years old. This is what I've been grappling with my whole life. So I can't very much be specific about it, except that whenever I tried to express it in different ways, either the people around me were not ready for it or accepting of it. What I mean by that is that I wanted the Jesus of now, the immediacy of Jesus here now, not in as beautiful and as inspiring as the edifice of a beautiful church or a small basilica or a small chapel is. The Jesus doesn't only exist there. The Jesus is with us. And how is that expressed? Is it expressed with people towards us, or does change come from within, which is what I believe it does? Change does come from within. You could force it from without, but it comes from within, and that change, for me, is always guided by the concept of Jesus. And so I tried for many years to find how Jesus is expressed in the world around me, how I thought I was expressing Jesus and was not. Making mess of things, pride, ego, the film director, all of this. So for me, this was suddenly, I felt that I could actually try to approach this again more directly, as I had tried with Last Temptation of Christ, let's say, or with, to a certain extent, Kundun, but certainly in silence. I think that was the most, that by the time I had done silence, I felt I had at least begun to grapple with the mystery in the right way.
A personal question. Did you ever think about becoming a priest? I think so. Well, I think so. There are some priests there.
Yes.
I think so, because you were in seminary preparatory school.
Yes.
So if so, why did you desire it, and what did you imagine? Was it to find peace or out of admiration, or did you feel a calling, a vocation? And then did you leave, or were you invited to leave?
I was invited to leave.
Yeah, but the question is, being a priest, being a priest and being a filmmaker, do these two things have to do with each other? Do these two things have to do with each other for your life?
Well, for me, the big change in my life was there were several major ones, one of which was living in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, on the Italian-American Sicilian neighborhood in the 1940s and all through the 50s and the 60s. This was a very strong experience, to say the least. You could tell if you've known some of my films. My father and mother were one of each side of the family had 7 or 8 children, and they were aunts. I had many aunts and uncles. They were born on Elizabeth Street in 1912 and 1913, not in a hospital. And so I grew up, in a sense, in a very old world, very much the world of the villages outside of Palermo. Cimina and Polizzi General. Yeah, so in a way, these are the people, and some Neapolitans, maybe some Calabrese. But mainly Neapolitan Sicilians. So in any event, Sicilians. In any event, in New York, that was, it was a rough area. It was a very, very difficult place. It was street tough, very much so. At that time was the American phenomena of the juvenile delinquent. Gang wars and that sort of thing. But primarily it was structured by the family structure, and the family structure was the unit for decency, really, from my mother and father, from my aunts and uncles and that sort of thing. But around us, we were living in a place that was, one could say, is indecent, between the organized crime and also the the very end of life for so many men and some women on the Bowery. What you call now homeless, but at that time we would call alcoholics or bums, or, and we lived with them. We got to know them. We were frightened of them. We were frightened of everything, basically. But in any event, that world was very, very difficult for me anyway. I developed serious asthma at the age of 3, which almost gave me, and I'll get to the point soon, almost gave me a kind of a relief in a way from having to prove myself with fake masculinity, which or macho, which I could still kind of admire, but I didn't have to prove myself that way very often. But I had to find a way to use my head in order to stay alive. There was one other figure around the corner from us was the first Catholic cathedral in New York, and that's the old St. Patrick's, now it's the Basilica. I think it was 1812 it was built. And so I was thrown into the Catholic school there by my parents. They said, go around the corner, go to school. And the nuns were Sisters of Mercy, I think. In any event, I spent a lot of time in that church. And at that time, the pastor and a number of the priests were for the old generation. In fact, they hardly spoke English. It was mainly Italian. So we seemed distanced from them. Then around 1953, a young priest came in. His name was Francis Principe, and it was his first parish. And he was 23 years old. And he suddenly brought a whole fresh way of looking at life to us. He would be very annoyed with me because I wouldn't play any sports. He didn't quite understand that. I was told I couldn't play any sports. If I did, I'd get sick and I couldn't breathe. But in any event, what he did was represent a way of thinking and a way of dealing with life that was very, very different from a kind of harsh, judgmental, cruel world that I was living in. He would look at us and say, "You don't have to live like this, And the first thing he gave us was the books of Graham Greene. And we started reading, The Power and the Glory. The best for me was The Heart of the Matter. All of this. The essays of Dwight MacDonald, which at that time in the early 50s was rather. I then found James Joyce somehow. I don't know. By the time we did Dubliners and, primarily Portrait of the Artist. Then at that time was the beginning of the civil rights movement, and sort of stumbled into James Baldwin. I had never really seen African Americans aside from a few that were on the Bowery. I never spoke to one. So this was an opening of the world. He played music for us. He loved cinema. And he made sense. He made sense morally because we'd be taught these street lessons by him. As to right and wrong or ethics. And he counterbalanced the old world in a way and opened us up to a new way of thinking. And so he had such an effect on me that I realized I couldn't really exist. And the opportunities that were open to us in that area weren't very many. One of which was you could be a tough guy, you could be in an organized crime. It wasn't for me. A few of my friends, yes, but it wasn't for me. You could, after that, what was there? Catholic education, which I had at Cardinal Hayes High School. And the world changed when I went to New York University, which at that time, that school was not the way it is now. It was called Washington Square College. And my whole way of thinking was that I found that things were so difficult to deal with in that world. And I saw him as a kind of clarity and also an example of love, different from my parents, but a very strong example of love that I wanted to be like him. So I decided I wanted to be a priest. And so for the high school, I went for the first year to Cathedral College was a preparatory seminary in New York. And within 2 months, I realized, I was maybe 14, I think, but within 2 months, I realized it wasn't for me. And I stopped studying, I became a clown in class, that sort of thing. But the point was that I began to realize just because you love someone, you want to be with them and be like them, you have to have a vocation. A vocation is a serious thing. It's not, oh, I want to be like that person. It's not that easy. He would always tell us, in order to have a vocation, you must love the Mass. And I didn't know what he meant. I was an altar boy, but I was always late, and they would get mad at me and that sort of thing. So I really, I didn't really understand this sort of thing. And so that was the first big lesson in which I realized that I was trying to hide by being a priest. I was trying to hide from life, fear, the fear of being hurt, the fear of hurting others. And I thought maybe I could guide. Instead, one has to have a true love and a true understanding, I think, of the mystery of God's love. One really has to explore that and understand that you may not ever get there, but that's what it's all about. It's like when you make a film. They say, oh, now you finished the film. Well, not really. It's always here. And they said, do you see your films again? No. I made them. I'm still making them. I'm still making them.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So about this movie, in the script you wrote about your idea to make a movie about Jesus. We published the script on La Civitta Catolica on the website, and you can find it in English, of course. You are thinking about a movie about Jesus since the 60s.
Oh yes, right. Around that time, when I realized the vocation wasn't for me, that it's about others and not myself, not your own salvation. I mean, yes, if you can, but it's about being with others. Once I realized that there was another passion that was in me, and that was for the moving image, pictures that moved. Stories, really, I should say, not just pictures, stories. And I had to go to pictures because in my family, my mother and father were working in the garment district in New York. They never read a book. So there were no books in the house. So I had to bring books in. I had to learn how to read. I had to learn how to live with the book. Meaning if a book was more than 200 pages, I had to learn the patience. And so I saw and I experienced everything through the street and the storytellers of the street, which are wonderful. The ones on the street corner, the tough guys telling stories with a great sense of humor about themselves, my mother's storytelling, my father's, my uncle's. I learned all that. And the only way I thought I could express it was through images, pictures, because that's how I grew up seeing art. That and the art in the church. And so for me, this quest to explore Jesus had to find its way to cinema. And so I had planned to make one in 16 millimeter black and white. This was 1961, I think, or so. And by that point, I was at Washington Square College, and I was beginning to take film courses, although this film school idea, they don't show you how to make a film. You can't learn that. It's really more about the master and the student. And we had a very good teacher named Haig Manoujian, who was Armenian-American, and he had a lot of passion for this sort of thing and for me. And so I followed his directions. He saw something in me. And at that time, I wanted to make the story of Jesus in modern day, in the Lower East Side, in the tenements and on the Bowery, culminating in the crucifixion on the New York City docks, with the West Side Highway, which is no longer there, And then I went to see Pasolini's Gospel According to Matthew, and I realized, can't be done. He's already done it. And Pasolini's film is just great poetry, and he actually, in that film, because of the style, and the style was the style of the late 50s, early 60s of the new cinema, the new French New Wave, the Italian New Wave, the British New Wave, but primarily cinema verite. He made you feel as if you were there. And he gave us an immediacy of Jesus, and also a Jesus that was not a movie star. Now, God bless the movie stars who tried to play it. It was a very hard role for Jeffrey Hunter and others who were trying to play that. But when you saw this face that you'd never seen before, and all the other faces of the people, and Matera, the town of Matera, and then, of course, the way he portrayed Jesus, all within the Gospel of Matthew, the anger, the strength, the beauty, and the music. The music, and Misa Luba, and even Leadbelly, and of course Bach. And so this was a great work of art, I thought. And I said, if I ever had to make a film on Jesus, I have to find another way to approach this extraordinary situation. There was no way. So for years I had been intending then to make a film on life of Christ.
What do you mean by immediacy of Christ?
Well, in the case of, if you want to look at film, Pasolini's Christ is the guy. It's not somebody who walks in the room and glows. Mm-hmm. He's there. He's in the corner.
He's there,
and he comes over here, and we're all together. It's the one. It's sometimes the one who's in the corner you don't see. You know, the first is last, the last is first, and so that's fascinating to me. The other films that had been made up to that time were at times pageantries and very, very, very piously made, which was good. I mean, you could see it in some of the great paintings, some of the great Michelangelo. They do have halos, you know. But what Pasolini was able to do was to make the Jesus figure and the others around him somebody you would know, somebody you could speak with, you know. This I think is really key. The immediacy of Jesus for me, though, is in your own life, is the people around you, the tests that you have in your own life, and I think, you know, the help of Jesus to get past yourself, to deal with others.
But despite Pasolini, you did not desist from wanting a movie about Jesus, and out of that desire came The Last Temptation of Christ.
Yes.
What's the meaning of that movie? It seems to be a carnal, visceral movie. There seems to be an obsession in it and something unresolved. So what moved it? Were you satisfied with it? And it's interesting to me that although you mention other movies of yours in the script you write, you didn't mention that one at all. So
well, I could answer that first because it's like a button that's pressed with that film. Suddenly, anger and resentment. Let's take that all away. Okay. Let's think about that. Let's say there's a fictional film on Jesus. Yeah. Okay. And this is what he does, and this is what he thinks, and this is what happens. He has to struggle to be the Messiah. He has to want to be the Messiah. And at the end, he is, and this is a beautiful idea by Kazantzakis, he is tempted, not by power or anything, he's tempted to live a normal life because the life God has given us is so beautiful. The life around him, the growing of his produce or agriculture, the love of a woman, the wife, the children, raising children, the life he gives Jesus as a temptation, as the devil gives Jesus as a temptation, is something that's so beautiful. And it's almost as if God envies the life he gave us humans. And I thought that was so beautiful as an idea, The main point, though, for me was that the misunderstanding of the way Jesus was presented to us in the mid-20th century in New York, I can only speak for myself now, and as a child's point of view, well, Jesus is on the cross and he dies on the cross for our sins. All right. Well, what does that mean? Not sure. Well, he's God, so he could die on the cross. He doesn't have to suffer. You see, this is because he's fully God and fully man. So the confusion became like, well, sure, it's easy for Jesus, but what about us? What about us when we suffer? You see, what about us when we get angry? What about us when we misunderstand and then years later we realize, oh my God, I've been wrong all along and I have to do repentance, so to speak. All of these things. And what about fear? What about anger? Well, it's in Jesus too. And in that story, I'm not speaking for the book. We tried in the film. In that story, we show that, we try to show that the very fact that he was fully human, embracing death, is absolutely terrifying. And that's why I had Lazarus' hand almost pull Jesus back into the tomb with him. And Willem Dafoe, as Jesus pulls back, he gets frightened because he realizes what he has to go through. And so that whole idea of it's easy for Jesus because he's God, well, no, Jesus shows us the way that we can be capable of these things. And so that was one aspect that I wanted to get across. There is another, which is that the Jesus that I found fascinating and I found codified in the Bible, in the translations, I should say, of the New Testament, some of the translations, not all. One has to understand too a little bit more of the history of that place and that time, the publicans who were tax collectors and what they meant, the prostitutes, all this sort of thing. Well, here's the Pharisees and the Sadducees saying this guy's hanging out and drinking with he's drinking wine with prostitutes and tax collectors, and we don't understand tax collectors. To us, for younger people, we thought CPAs. People that, oh, what'd you spend? No, these were not. These were extortionists. These were gangsters, and so he's with the worst kind of people, and he's condemned for that. And like I realized when I did taxi driver, when I grew up on the Bowery, and then I put a lot of those elements in Taxi Driver, and we were on 8th Avenue between 43rd Street, or 43rd Street and 52nd Street. It was the end of civilization there, just the end of civilization. And that's where Jesus is. That's the film I wanted to make for them who say, I'm a drunk, I'm a drug addict, I'm a prostitute, I'm this, I'm that, I'm mean, I have no heart. I am nothing in my life. I don't deserve to be loved. And that's the Jesus I wanted, and that's why Last Temptation was presented that way.
Talking about another movie, I really was struck by the movie's Silence. Silence. What did silence mean to you? I found it a deeply spiritual film. Did it have an impact on your life? I mean, both in thinking about it, but also in making it, and then maybe after making it. Did it leave an inner trace in you? If so, of what kind? And again, in your opinion, is it a step forward from Last Temptation of Christ? And in what direction?
Yes, I think it's important because as we were doing Temptation, which was an extremely difficult film to make, there's very little money to make it, I had touched upon all the iconography of the church, which is the crowning of thorns, all of this, the Sermon on the Mount, everything, but primarily the crucifixion. And we're under duress all the time, just great pressure. And when the film was finished, or never really was quite finished because it was an outcry at the time, and we had to release the film unfinished, but it became more than a movie, so it's not really a movie in a way. I realized that I had to go further into the story of Jesus, or not the story, but the concept. I had to explore further because maybe there was a part of me that had to create this crucifixion, that had to create the raising of Lazarus, that had to make my versions, but that's not the story of Jesus, you see. And so I found that by getting all this done, I wasn't really closer, even though I felt so strong. I felt the presence of Jesus with me. You could say, oh, egomaniac, but under the circumstances, it was so difficult in the desert, and we were just driven, all of us. I felt it, but I didn't get there. And the night that the film was shown to the to the different religious groups. There was a little dinner around the corner in a hotel, and the only friend of mine, Father John Keenan, we were in the seminary together, he was there, and Archbishop Paul Moore and his wife, the Episcopal Church in New York. He showed up, he said, because the film was Christologically correct. And so we sat down, and he told us stories about himself and his life, having been in the war and what he changed from the war experience. And this is for me too. I'm talking about my own sensitivity in the Lower East Side and wise guys and alcoholics and this sort of thing. Is nothing compared to what people go through in a war experience, you know. So, but that's all I know, and I know that that's how I reacted. But he said, "I'm going to give you a book. It's called Silence," and he described some of it to me, and that was 1988. I held on to the book and took it with me to Japan in '89. After I had to make Goodfellas because I owed them a film, and they let me go to make Last Temptation in Hollywood because all the studio heads knew how much I wanted to make it, and I was driving them crazy. And anyway, they made it all work. Those guys. It was quite something to see different studio heads come together and say, "All right, well, we'll forgive that debt. We'll move that over here and go ahead and do that. But when you come back, finish this film." And it was Goodfellas. And on the last days of shooting Goodfellas, Akira Kurosawa was waiting for me to be in his movie, to play Van Gogh. And I was late, and he was 82 years old, and he was waiting. Japan, yeah. And so we had to get there, and I took the book with me, and that's where I read the book, and that's when I realized when the moment of Jesus' voice saying, you know, step on me. That moment for me was so overwhelming. It was on the bullet train, I remember, and I said, I have to make this. There was only one major problem that I didn't understand yet. I don't know if I still do, but I didn't see a way. But I knew that I had to pursue this. And that began a 20-some-odd year odyssey of different producers, different people, trying to write the script and trying to understand exactly what Endo was going for at that point and what Rodriguez went through and Garupe and all of them. And the whole concept. Also, I had to learn more about Japan's history and more about the Jesuits in Japan. So there was a lot to do. I think I started writing the script a little too soon, and we got stuck on certain scenes, and I put it away. I said, let me put it away, and I went off and made some other films. And I think it was around 2008 or 9, I think, when finally I laid it out on the page in terms of construction, and was able to convince my friend Jay Cox to come in with me and ultimately write the script. And we finally got the draft I liked. The problem then was the legal issues. There were so many different producers and people who had claims on it, and it took another 4 or 5 years or so for some old friends of mine to try to undo the damage that was done, like the Gordian knot, in a way, of undoing these things. That's why you see so many producers on that film. It doesn't. They did do something, but primarily it's because they stayed with the film for 3 years and they didn't do it. Then another 2 years and I didn't do it. But in any event, all of that was about trying to understand what, not if I understand, but to come to terms with what Rodriguez did. And all of that, building that at one moment. And so I know that when we went to Taiwan to shoot the film, it was Ang Lee who sent us to Taiwan. You know, the director, he's a great director, and he said, you go there, man, we have everything. And we use Hao Xiaoshan's sets, and it was an extra, but the film, the making of the film, had an impact on everybody on the crew. Everybody on the crew. It was a difficult shoot. I thought Temptation was difficult. This was even harder. But I never saw people work so hard and with smiles under earthquakes and typhoons and the seasons for the Taiwanese cobra, which apparently they have a season. Which they didn't tell me about, but it's okay. You don't have to. You go to Taiwan, it's all right. But in any event, it was a shooting in a typhoon was extraordinary, and the Japanese actors, the Japanese, the ones who got on the crosses with the water hitting them. This was they insisted on staying up there. I said, no, come down. No, I do more shots for you, you know. And these were remarkable actors. But I get very excited about that particular film. It was a very beautiful experience with Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver, you know. And so that became, by the time, that night, when we shot that scene where Andrew Garfield has to step on the fume, the stunt people were upside down in the pits. But, you know, it was very difficult for them. And it was around 5 a.m. And as soon as he steps on the fume, we hear the cock crow for real. So, okay. You know,
wow.
we're chilled. And, you know, and when he did it, Andrew did it so beautifully. And, you know, the Issei Ogata up there as Inoue, it was something that no one will ever forget. It was 5, then 6 a.m. We all stumbled home, you know, to the hotel. But I think for me, I had so much in my head about silence and so much about the missionary work at that time. You know, I'm not an authority on it, but it's a matter of, in a way, the way I saw the behavior or the example that Jesus gives, the example, let's say, that Father Principe gave me most of the time. Maybe this is the way to go about missionary work. You say, I want to be like that person. Well, that person, I want to be like that person. If she did that, when I was sick, they stayed in the room. They didn't leave, you know? Well, why is that person that way? And then you find a little more, And if you say, well, this person has faith of a certain kind, you might be more interested, you might understand. But I think that's probably one of the things that Rodriguez felt, that this may not be the way to deal with Jesus in another culture.
But Ari Aster, commenting on silence, said that just by denying God, Kichihiro became a true Christian. Do you agree with that?
No,
Why?
I think he may have simplified that. I think it's, because he is very articulate on the film. And Ari is a unique filmmaker. His latest film, Beau is Afraid, is 3-hour, hilarious Kafkaesque nightmare. I mean, just madness. But again, taking chances, you know. But Ari, I think, is talking about the fact that in giving up is when you get it. In giving it up and saying, I'm not going to crush it, I'm not going to hold on to it anymore. And it goes, and suddenly is when you receive the grace. And I think that's what happens with Rodriguez. And I think that's what Rodriguez realizes. I embrace the mystery of life and death, which is what Jesus is. It's the great mystery. And the beauty of it, we'll never know the end of it. You know, we're just not going to know. But in the process of living it, you embrace it and you know, try to do something that, I mean, if you're lucky enough to be able to create something, if you call it art, that's a gift. It's a gift. And it was St. Augustine said, right, the art is beautiful because it reflects God, in a way. Any kind of creation, it really does. And the more, through art, is where you learn about the other cultures and all of this. But it really is an attempt for us to make sense of our existence, right? I don't have to tell you, you know that. So for me, Rodriguez realizes, no, it's the embrace. It's the embrace of the mystery. It's the embrace of the people around me. They don't have to die on the cross. They simply don't, even though there are many who say, no, they're the real heroes of the film. Yes, I understand that. And there's been some criticism about the film that filmmakers are more like there's a phrase they use now called cultural elite, where we'll take that from Catholicism or that from Buddhism. I'm not going there. I mean it. When he stepped on that fumi, he stepped on it, and he knew what he was doing. And the first night in Rome, when the film was shown of a group of Jesuits, the first question I got was, "Would you do that? Would you step on it?" And I said, "Well, if Jesus told me, if I heard Jesus tell me to step on it, I'd step on it, because Rodriguez heard Jesus." Well, maybe it was, we don't know, he heard Jesus. And so for me, all of these questions come together, and I think ultimately it's a very special attempt at an understanding. I don't know if it's a successful movie, but it's an attempt at an understanding.
Huge movie. Wow. Again, about Jesus. In the script you wrote after reading the preface written by Pope Francis, you wrote, "Jesus contains multitudes." And that sounds like a quote from...
Well, it's Walt Whitman. Yeah.
Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan, too. Come on.
And Walt Whitman. Exactly. So, but what do you mean by that? So in what sense does Jesus contain multitudes? Which kind of multitudes?
I think it's pretty obvious. I think it's the multitudes of humanity. And it's Jesus showing us, giving us a direction, showing us the way to be able to live. And I mean that in to deal with anger and revenge and retribution and love and forgiveness, all of that together. And he shows us the way. It's not easy, as we all know, but he is the example. And I think is the example for the multitudes, because he is all of us. That's what I see.
All of us. He is all of us. We are many things.
Yes.
There is good and bad. There is also violence in us.
Yes.
And there are a lot of violence in your movies.
Yes. Yeah.
And in her book, Absence of Mind, Marilyn Robinson wrote, "We are brilliantly creative and equally brilliantly destructive." So this makes human being inexplicable. And you seem to want to stage real, not artificial, grotesque violence. So why? What does violence teaches us? Which was your experience of violence?
Well,
and does violence teach us something? And
If anything, I grew up in a very violent place, and that it just was. In the way many people growing up now in a very violent place. I'm not only talking about the obvious wars that are going on. I'm talking about in neighborhoods and areas where now in America everybody has a gun. Never did I ever think that such a thing would happen, you know. And so it's an extraordinarily violent life. The violence I saw around me, the violence I experienced, sometimes was overshadowed by the emotional violence, where there was no physical violence, but the emotional violence was even more terrifying. But the thing about violence, to me, two aspects. One, the major point is who we are, the human condition. To deny it will only prolong a bad reckoning with violence. To deny it, you must face it. You must understand that it's in us, in our human nature. In our very, very human nature. There might be many people who are very sweet and have not one aspect of it. I don't know. I'm speaking from my own experience and a lot of people I know. To understand that and then to overcome that and not to be ashamed of it. This is the key. It was one time a Tibetan monk once told me 20 years ago, he said, "Oh, I saw your film." We were in Washington with the Dalai Lama. He said, "I saw your film, Gangs in New York." I said, "Oh," see, I said, "It's a little violent." He goes, "No, don't be upset." He says, "It's your nature." I was suddenly very moved. Yeah, it's maybe my nature. All right, well, then I have to deal with that if that's my nature. And we have to know we're capable of it. There was a great writer who recently saw Killers of the Flower Moon. And Killers of the Flower Moon, which is the new film we finished, we showed at Cannes, There's a concentrated effort to pretty much kill off all the Osage Native Americans for their oil money. And not just by guns or bad liquor, but marrying the women and then letting or helping the women to die. So you inherit. See, this was 1921, 22. And at one point, I was talking to this writer, a famous man. I said, I can't understand how anybody could do this. He said, anybody could marry this woman, be in love with her, and it's a true story. She in love with him, have children together, and he's helping poison her. And I said, I can't imagine anybody. He said, well, if anyone could do it, then we're all capable of it. And this is frightening. And he's a remarkable man who said this too, but I don't want to give away the confidence. But the point is to understand the violence. So if you make violence exciting or expressionistic in a way, it could be quite beautiful, like The Wild Bunch, Sam Peckinpah, But if you make violence fake, I don't know any other way to shoot it except what I saw. There is another element to show the ugliness of it and the awkwardness of it. I learned that sometimes about watching some of the Fassbinder films years ago and just growing up in the Bowery where I was. But there was another element, too, which is even more troubling, and that is growing up in that area and my own nature, as the monk said, my own attraction to violence and being excited by violence. So this is something we have to understand and face that in ourselves, too. And we have to know that truth about ourselves. There's the sparks of it, Because in the neighborhood, in the old neighborhood, the fights in the street, that was very exciting, But then there were killings. I didn't witness any, but I know the people who were killed. And it wasn't pleasant, And it wasn't funny, and it wasn't exciting, I can tell you that. So violence for me can't be, you could have a beautifully choreographed, like what sometimes the great Chinese director Zhang Yimou would do, or as I say, Peckinpah and others, or Wong Kar-wai, and do incredible violent sequence, but that's ballet. It's ballet, it's fantastic. How these guys, men and women do this stuff, I don't know. It's phenomenal. But it does distance you, there's no doubt. I'm not saying they're wrong, I'm saying that I feel distanced from them. But when you get the impact of, you're going back to, even John Ford had it, but Sam Fuller's films, but he really had, the power of Fuller's movies was about the emotional violence that he had. In every frame, you could feel it. It was going to explode any second. And then later on, at the same time as watching Sam Fuller's films, I'm watching the Italian neorealist films. I'm watching Europa. Well, we finally found a good copy of Europa 51. Francesco, the Little Flowers of St. Francis. So violence for me, I find that, especially in America now, by distancing oneself from it, it's worse. I think we have to understand and embrace the violence in ourselves and our association with it.
It's not an easy time to have faith in God, in God's love. Pope Francis preaches a God who is mercy, whose name is mercy. You once told me in an interview we made years ago that when you were an altar boy, going out on the street after Mass ended, you wondered, how is it possible that life goes on as if nothing has happened right after Mass? Yes. And why has nothing changed? Why is the world not being shaken by the body and blood of Christ? Mm-hmm. These were your questions. Mm-hmm. You told me that. Mm-hmm. So do you have hope that people today can still feel his presence? And what is mercy to you?
I do think that once I was so taken by that as a young person, and I do realize that in the beginning of Mean Streets, where Harvey Keitel says you don't make up for your sins, meaning you don't live life, you don't lead a Catholic or Christian life, you don't make up for your sins in church. You do it in the streets, you do it at home, and the rest is nonsense, And so in a way, the transubstantiation isn't only in the building. It has to resonate throughout the rest of the world, you see. In order to do that, we have to be responsible for some of that ourselves. It's how we act, having experienced the transubstantiation in church, to take Jesus and to take God out of the church, in a sense, into the streets and into the home, most of all. And as this, for me, is the reality. Have I succeeded in my own life? I don't know. I don't think so. I'm 80 years old now. I don't know. But I found that at that time, that was the main task, because I saw things happening all week, craziness. Then we all show up at the 12:30 Mass on Sunday. You know, it's like one of the wise guys on Mott Street, an older guy at that time, not older for us at the time, we were in our teens, but he was a great thief, and he would go and pray to God to give him strength to steal some more. Something not quite right, but but this is where it came from. Yes. So I said, no, you shouldn't be praying for that. It's the other way. And so, but this is the reality of the desperation of life for some people. So for me, I do think the resonance of the transubstantiation has to be outside the church. It really does. And the laity is so important now in the church to take part in it. And we see the two words now constantly, justice and mercy, justice and mercy. I wonder why mercy shouldn't be first. I know, because justice becomes, it's a cry for blood, it's retribution, and more until they're all dead. And somehow it's got to stop at some point.
My last question, please. My last question. Well, time flies, but I would like to stay with you for hours and hours, and I think all of us here. But the last questions. What's God's grace to you? We spoke about grace many times when we met, and I learned a lot from you, I have to say, I have to admit. How do you experience the grace of God?
That's a hard question. I mean, maybe as you said, you learned from me. I didn't teach. I was just talking. You know, I don't have a theological background that way, and I just don't. But I do know that the more denial and the more rejection I got was a form of grace to begin again and begin again and begin again, even to the point where at one point I was almost dead in a hospital. And somehow I made it through. I remember telling the story to a Native American kind of a poet, philosopher, medicine man in 1980 in LA. He was blind. His name was Storm. And he looked at me and he said, "In that hospital, you died. You are now resurrected." He was right. He was right. Prior to that, the grace that night that I was in that car in 1963, in November, 2 weeks before Kennedy got killed, in a car. My neighborhood didn't have cars. You don't have cars. It was too congested. But there was a young guy who came around. He was a off-duty cop. He behaved brashly. He had a gun with him. You never showed guns in those places. You never wore a gun. Because it was very dangerous. But he had his cop thing and he had his gun. But he had a car, a convertible. And we were so bored. And he was behaving, I must say, he was behaving boorishly. But we put up with it. Well, he's got a car. Maybe he'll take us for coffee somewhere. We get out of here. We go to upstate or something to get some coffee, come back. At least it's something. And don't forget, I was still, at that time at New York University, I'm trying to read Henry James. I'm trying to, it's like a split, because I was living with my parents on Elizabeth Street. So we get in the car, we go with him around. There's lots of activities in the street that night, lots of drinking in the clubs, the after-hours clubs, the illegal clubs. And he had a friend of his in the front seat. And I think it was 1 a.m, and we're about to, it was dark in those days in '63. There were no lights in the doorways of the city, any of the buildings. Years later, in '65, '66, they had to be. So everything was very dark. So myself and my friend Joe were sitting in the back seat, and we get in the car. But bottom line, he gets into an altercation with some people in front of him. The car wouldn't move. He got out. They were arguing. Came back. He showed his gun. He showed his police thing to them. Move your car. They said, okay, and they moved the car. So my friend Joe and I looked at each other. This is too much. This is too much. The guy's acting like a fool. I said, well, let's go home. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. I said, yeah. So we said, good night, good night. We went home. They drove off. Within 5 minutes, they were shot. On Astor Place, where the Cube is, if you know it. Bullets, and the kid in the front got his eye shot out. And the next morning, I didn't know. The next morning, my friend Joe saw me, and he said, borrowed time. Nobody knows we were in that car. Thank God we got out. You know, why? Why did that happen? We would have been killed, you know, or at least greatly maimed, to say the least. And so from that moment on, it was something that around the same time as knowing Father Principe, at the same time as NYU, at the same time as being open to cinema and all the great new cinema that was being made that could be made now with easier equipment, lighter equipment, all this was a way out. And there seemed to be some kind of a guide or a demand for me to do something. And I poured what I felt in terms of my questioning and my search for Jesus, for my love for the church and all that, into the creation of films, in a way. And somehow, all the themes, Mean Streets, Raging Bull, Casino even, you know, they all deal with these things. I just happened to make a career of films that, for the most part, I really, really, really wanted to make, which, that's a trade-off. You don't get the Oscars, you don't get the, you get a lot of recognition, but you also have to put up with the periods in which you are what they call in Hollywood washed up. And you come back, the grace to be rejected, the grace to be despised. And you say, okay, now look, I'm going to start again, okay? And we go in and we try it again. In the same way that Mean Streets to Last Temptation to Kundun to Silence to The Irishman, even The Irishman, And one last thing, it's interesting about love and the depth of understanding of people, particularly who are violent. There was a very actually interesting review in a British literary supplement, which was quite good. I enjoy it. But one element in the review of the film bothered me, or actually didn't bother me. I said, it's interesting that he sees it this way. And the reviewer, or the writer, he's a very good writer, this man, said, yes, I like this, I like that about the film, et cetera, et cetera. But since when do gangsters worry about their souls? So that's the whole point. That's the whole point. The point is that that's human beings. This is who we are. I understand what he means. I get it. But it was so dismissive of a whole swathe of humanity. It was, they're just gangsters, they're just drug addicts. No. They say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.